The dust of the Arizona Territory was a character in itself, a fine red powder that painted the world in shades of rust and rose. It settled on the brims of hats, crept into the folds of laundry, and gave the air a taste of grit and distance. This dust was ancient, the ground-down bones of mountains that had seen ages pass. It swirled in eddies around the weathered planks of dry cedar, a town clinging to existence beside the capricious San Juan River and a vital stagecoach artery. The river was the town's life and its potential death. In the dry months, it was a lazy, silver ribbon, but with the first hint of mountain rain, it could swell into a brown, churning monster, chewing at its banks and rearranging the landscape with casual indifference. The wind was the dust's accomplice, a restless spirit that whispered through the sparse cottonwoods and howled across the plains, sometimes carrying the scent of distant rain, other times building into sandstorms that could scour a trail clean of tracks and blind a traveler in minutes. Into this world of raw edges and stark beauty came Evelyn Hart. She was barely 23, with eyes the color of a summer sky and a resolve forged in the quieter, greener hills of the East. Her father, a man of books and gentle philosophies, had passed a year prior, leaving her with a small inheritance and a powerful yearning for a life of her own making, a life unbound by the rigid expectations of her former home. The West, she had read, was a place where a person's worth was measured by their spine, not their lineage. And so she had come to Dry Cedar to teach, to shape young minds, and perhaps to find the freedom that felt as vast and real as the horizon. Her first day in the one-room schoolhouse was a study in contrasts. The faces looking up at her were a mosaic of the territory. There were the freckled, sun-bleached children of homesteaders, their hands calloused from farm chores. There were the pale, watchful children of the silver miners from the nearby hills, and the dark-eyed children of the Dine, the people who lived on the ancestral lands that bordered the river. Their gazes met hers with a mixture of shyness, defiance, and a raw, untempered curiosity that she found instantly endearing. She began not with arithmetic, but with a story, her voice a clear, steady counterpoint to the wind sighing against the window panes. She spoke of courage, of kindness, of bridges built between people. And as she spoke, she saw the walls between the children begin to thin, replaced by the shared magic of a well-told tale. Later that afternoon, the world outside the schoolhouse reasserted itself. The saloon was the town's heart and its mouth, a place where rumors were born and watered with cheap whiskey. The air was thick with the smell of stale beer, sweat, and tobacco. A low murmur of conversation filled the room, a current of anxiety running just beneath the surface. The name on everyone's lips was the Red Basin Riders, a gang of outlaws known for their ruthlessness. Word had come down the line that they were planning to hit the next silver payroll shipment, a prize that could either flood the town with prosperity or drain it dry. Lucius Brand sat at a corner table, a glass of amber liquid untouched before him. He was a cattle baron, a man whose ambition was as wide as the territory itself. His ranch land sprawled for miles, and his gaze had the acquisitive gleam of a man who saw the world as property yet to be claimed. He listened to the talk, a faint, reptilian smile playing on his lips. The fear of the townspeople was a tool, and he was a master craftsman. He let the silence around his table grow, his presence a weight in the room. When he finally spoke, his voice was not loud, but it cut through the din like a razor. He suggested that the Red Basin Riders could not operate so boldly without help, without eyes and ears on the inside. His gaze drifted pointedly towards the door. Just as a man stepped out of the harsh sunlight and into the gloom. The man was Cayanez. He was Dine, a man who moved with a quiet economy of motion that made him seem a part of the landscape itself. His face was a stoic mask, his eyes dark and deep, holding the memory of things seen and endured. He had once scouted for the cavalry, a past that had earned him the distrust of his own people and the wary respect of the very few white men who understood his skill. Now he tended horses and carried mail, a life of quiet solitude. He had come to the saloon only to deliver a message for the smithy, but as he entered, The conversations faltered. The whispers followed him like his shadow. Informant, tracker, a man who walked between worlds and belonged to neither. Lucius Brand's insinuation hung in the air, a poison seeking a vein. Kaya met the cattleman's stare for a brief, unblinking moment, his expression unreadable, before turning and leaving as silently as he had arrived. The seed of suspicion had been planted. Brand wanted the fertile land by the river, the land the Dane had farmed for generations. An outlaw raid, and a convenient scapegoat, would be just the pretext he needed to convince the town to drive them out. Sheriff Cole Matters watched the exchange from the bar, a troubled look on his pragmatic face. He was a man caught in a vice, squeezed between the law he was sworn to uphold and the immense influence of Lucius Brand. He knew Brand's greed was a dangerous wildfire, but the man owned half the territory and held the town's prosperity in his fist. Matters finished his drink and walked out into the afternoon heat, his boots kicking up puffs of red dust. He found Kaya checking the shoes on a pinto tied to the hitching rail. The sheriff told him the early season rains were falling up in the mountains. The San Juan was getting restless. He needed a man who could read the water, who could tell if the river was planning to stay within its banks or if it was preparing to reclaim the floodplains. He needed Kaya. There were few men, white or native, who knew the river's moods as he did. Kaya listened, his hands never ceasing their gentle work on the horse's hoof. He did not look at the sheriff, but at the sky, where high, thin clouds were beginning to gather. He gave a single, curt nod. It was a job, nothing more, a way to earn a few dollars and be away from the stifling judgment of the town. He preferred the company of the wind and the water. They, at least, were honest in their intentions. Evelyn Hart had started a small, weekly news sheet for Dry Cedar, a single page of local happenings, announcements, and editorials she wrote herself. She saw it as an extension of the schoolhouse, a way to educate and connect the community, hearing the anxious talk of the Red Basin riders. She decided it was her duty to report on it, to separate fact from fear. Her inquiries led her from the general store to the blacksmith's forge, and eventually to the sheriff's office. Matters, weary and non-committal, confirmed the threat but offered few details. As Evelyn was leaving, she saw him speaking with Kaya Nez. She had noticed Kaya before. He moved with a grace that seemed at odds with the rugged land, a silent figure on the periphery of the town's life. She saw the way the other townsfolk avoided his eyes, the whispers that followed him. Yet, she also saw the gentleness with which he handled the horses in his care and the watchful intelligence in his gaze. Her Eastern education had taught her of prejudice in the abstract, as a historical wrong. Here, it was a living, breathing thing, as palpable as the dust in the air. Her reporter's curiosity mingled with a deeper, more personal interest. Who was this man who seemed to carry the weight of the wilderness in his silence? She wanted to understand the story written on his face, a story the town seemed determined to misread. That evening, the sky turned the color of a deep bruise. The wind, which had been a mere whisper all day, began to moan, rattling the wooden sign of the hotel and sending dust devils dancing down the main street. The air grew heavy, thick with the smell of ozone and damp earth. The clouds that had been gathering on the horizon now converged overhead, a dark, churning ceiling that blotted out the stars. The first drops of rain fell, fat and slow, striking the dry ground with a sizzle. They were the heralds of the coming deluge. A storm was breaking over Dry Cedar, a storm of water and wind that mirrored the tempest of fear and suspicion brewing in the hearts of its people. Out on the plains, Kaya Nez rode towards the San Juan. His face turned to the weather, reading the signs in the sky as easily as Evelyn read the words in a book. He was heading toward the river, his duty clear. Evelyn, having finished her rounds and feeling the first real chill of the high desert night, was making her way back from a homesteader's cabin near the river road, her mind full of the stories and anxieties she had gathered. The rain began to fall in earnest, a hard, driving sheet of water that turned the world to a gray blur. The river was stirring, and on its banks, where the red dust was quickly turning to slick mud. A different kind of storm was about to break. A storm that would irrevocably bind the fate of the quiet scout and the determined schoolteacher. The night was pregnant with danger, and the river, ancient and impartial, was waiting. The rain did not fall. It attacked. It came down in solid, wind-driven curtains that erased the world, turning the familiar landscape of rock and scrub into a churning, primordial chaos. The river road, a simple track of packed earth, dissolved into a shallow, fast-moving stream of red mud. The buckboard Evelyn Hart was riding in, a small mercy from a homesteader she had been interviewing, slid and lurched, the two horses fighting for purchase against the slick ground and the force of the wind. The driver, a farmer named Silas, squinted into the deluge, his knuckles white on the reins. The roar was constant, a combination of the wind, the hammering rain, and a deeper, more menacing sound from their right, the sound of the San Juan River waking from its slumber. Cayanez had felt the flood coming long before the first drop of rain fell in dry cedar. He had felt it in the unusual humidity, in the behavior of the animals, and in the deep, almost sub-audible tremor in the earth. He was perched on a high bluff overlooking a bend in the river, a position that gave him a clear view of the water's surge. He watched as the placid silver ribbon he had known his whole life transformed. It swelled with terrifying speed, its color darkening from silver to a muddy, roiling brown. Entire trees, ripped from the banks upstream, were tossed about in the current like twigs. The sound was a physical blow, a continuous thunder of water and grinding stone that vibrated through the rock beneath him. He was about to turn back, to carry his report to the sheriff, when he saw the faint, flickering light of a lantern far below on the river road. He recognized the buckboard. He had seen it pass him an hour earlier, heading out of town. The schoolteacher. A cold knot of apprehension tightened in his gut. They were too close to the water, far too close. The disaster happened with sickening speed. A wall of water, a flash flood born from a cloudburst miles up in the mountains, surged down the main channel. It leaped the river's banks as if they were nothing more than a minor inconvenience. The water smashed into the buckboard, lifting it and turning it sideways. The horses screamed, a sound of pure terror that was almost swallowed by the river's roar. Silas was thrown clear, a rag doll in the torrent. The buckboard disintegrated, its wooden plank splintering with a sound like pistol shots. Evelyn was plunged into the icy, violent water. The cold was a shock that stole her breath and paralyzed her limbs. She was tumbled end over end, the world a disorienting nightmare of brown water, debris, and crushing pressure. Her heavy wool skirt, a practical garment for the classroom, became a shroud, wrapping around her legs, dragging her down. Her lungs burned for air. She fought, her hands clawing at the water, but the river was an implacable beast. Her fingers brushed against something solid, a submerged branch, and her skirt snagged, holding her fast as the current tore at her. Darkness began to creep in at the edges of her vision. Kaya moved without conscious thought. His descent down the slick, treacherous bluff was a controlled fall. Using his deep knowledge of every handhold and foothold, he hit the floodwater in a shallow dive, the shock of the cold a familiar enemy. He was a strong swimmer, but this was not swimming. It was a battle. He fought his way toward the last place he had seen her, his eyes scanning the maelstrom. He saw a flash of dark fabric tangled in the submerged roots of an ancient cottonwood. He dove, his knife already in his hand. The current tried to rip him away, but his will was iron. He found her, her body limp, her hair a dark cloud in the water. He saw the snagged dress and sliced through the heavy fabric with two swift, powerful cuts. Freeing her was only the first part of the battle. Now he had to get them both out of the river's main current. He wrapped one arm around her chest, holding her head above the water, and used his other arm and his legs to fight his way laterally, toward a large, moss-covered outcropping of rock that had become a temporary island. Every muscle in his body screamed in protest. Logs and debris shot past them in the current, any one of which could kill them both instantly. Finally, with a last, lung-searing effort, he hauled her from the water and collapsed beside her on the relative safety of the rock. Gasping for air, the rain still lashing down on them. She was not breathing. Her skin was a terrifying, bluish white, and her lips were the color of slate. There was no time to think, only to act. He rolled her onto her side, clearing her airway, and then began to press rhythmically on her chest, a desperate, forceful cadence to push the river from her lungs. He worked with a fierce concentration, ignoring his own exhaustion, ignoring the cold that was sinking into his bones. After what felt like an eternity, she gave a ragged, sputtering cough. Water gushed from her mouth. She coughed again, a weak, shallow breath following. It was enough. He half-carried, half-dragged her to a small overhang on the rock that offered some slight protection from the wind and rain. With numb fingers, he worked with flint and steel, using a piece of dry punk he always carried in a waterproof pouch. He coaxed a tiny spark into a flame. Feeding it with slivers of wood he shaved from a piece of dry driftwood lodged in a crevice. As the fire grew, a small circle of warmth in the vast, wet darkness. He stripped off his own wool blanket and wrapped her in it. Tucking it tightly around her, he sat close, his own body a shield against the wind, sharing his heat. He watched her, his face illuminated by the flickering firelight. Her chest rose and fell with shallow, uneven breaths. In the grip of the river, he had been a machine of instinct and training. Now, in the aftermath, a wave of feeling so powerful it nearly staggered him washed over him. It was a terrifying, possessive, and profoundly protective emotion, something he had never experienced before. He had seen beauty, but this was different. He was looking at a life he had pulled back from the edge of death, a life that now felt inexplicably tied to his own. A strange phrase, a line he might have read over the shoulder of a passenger reading one of the Eastern newspapers Evelyn often shared with her students, surfaced in his mind. He whispered it aloud, the English words feeling clumsy and foreign on his tongue. Navajo warrior rescued a drowned beauty by the river. The thought was incomplete. It finished itself silently, a quiet, solemn vow made to the storm and the fire. She became his wild, eternal obsession. The thought both shamed and solidified him. It was a dangerous, impossible feeling. He could not stay. He heard the faint sound of shouting carried on the wind. A search party from the town. To be found here, with her, in this state, would be a death sentence of a different kind. He looked at her one last time. Then his eyes fell upon a yucca plant growing in a crack in the rock. His fingers moved with practiced speed, splitting a leaf and weaving the fibers into a small, tight circle, a traditional symbol of protection and well-being. He gently took her wrist and slipped the yucca bracelet over her cold hand. Then, as quietly as a shadow, he rose and disappeared into the rain-swept darkness, leaving behind only a dying fire, a warm blanket, and a life he had claimed from the river. Sheriff Cole Matters arrived 20 minutes later, his lantern cutting a weak yellow swath through the gloom. He found Evelyn huddled in the blanket, conscious but disoriented, shivering violently. He and the men with him, a grim-faced Lucius Brand among them, got her back to town. The sheriff, seeing the remnants of the fire and the blanket, announced to all who would listen that some nameless hero had saved the schoolteacher's life. He made it sound like one of the townspeople, a convenient narrative that required no difficult questions. Brand said nothing, but his eyes were hard and cold. He had seen the buckboard go into the water. More importantly, he knew Evelyn would have been on the very stretch of road where his men had been felling trees into the river, a deliberate act of sabotage designed to create a log jam and divert the floodwaters towards the dine farms in the valley. Her survival made her a liability. Hours later, tucked into her bed at the boarding house, warm and safe, Evelyn drifted in and out of a feverish sleep. Her memory of the night was a collection of violent, disjointed fragments, the terrifying roar of the water, the splintering of wood, the suffocating cold. But beneath the terror, other sensations lingered. The memory of strong arms pulling her from the depths, the flickering warmth of a fire on her face, the rough, comforting texture of a wool blanket, the feeling of steady, calloused hands pressing life back into her chest. It was all a blur, a dream born of trauma. But when she raised her own hand to her forehead, her fingers brushed against something on her other wrist. It was a small, intricately woven bracelet of pale green fibers. It was real. And in that moment, she knew the ghost in her memory had a face, and that she had to find him. The world after the flood was washed clean, but the memories remained, etched into Evelyn Hart's mind. In the days that followed her rescue, she moved through her life in Dry Cedar with a new and unsettling awareness. The town, which had once seemed a simple collection of honest, hard-working people, now felt layered with hidden currents and unspoken animosities. She saw the fear in the eyes of the homesteaders, the arrogance in the swagger of Lucius Brand's ranch hands, and the quiet, walled-off dignity of the dine who came to trade. And she felt the constant phantom weight of the yucca bracelet on her wrist, a mystery she was determined to solve. She brought the mystery into her classroom. Instead of reading from the dry primers sent from the east, she told her students the story of the flood. She spoke of the river's fury and the courage of a stranger, a man who appeared from the storm and vanished just as quickly, leaving behind only a small circle of woven grass. She did not name a hero, only the heroic act itself. The children were captivated. The homesteaders' sons and daughters imagined a brave cowboy or a stalwart miner. But Evelyn watched the die-in children. She saw a flicker of understanding in their dark eyes when she described the bracelet, a shared secret knowledge that she could not yet penetrate. The story became a lesson not just in literacy, but in courage, in helping a stranger not for reward, but because it was the right thing to do, from a distance. Kayanez watched her. He saw her leading the children in their games in the schoolyard, her laughter a bright sound against the ever-present wind. He saw the passion in her face as she taught, his obsession, born in the firelight on that storm-tossed rock, had not faded. It had settled into something deeper, a steady, watchful protectiveness. He began to see the world in terms of its potential threats to her. A loose shingle on the schoolhouse roof, rattling in the wind, was not just a loose shingle. It was a future leak that could ruin her books and maps. One moonless night, he climbed onto the roof as silently as an owl and fixed it, using a nail he had straightened and saved. His acts of guardianship were always invisible, always deniable. He would leave a string of smoked, dried fish on her doorstep before dawn, a gift that would be attributed to the kindness of a neighbor. He noticed the telltale tracks of a rattlesnake near the woodpile behind the school and knew the recent rains would make them bold. That evening, he gathered a pile of dry tumbleweeds in the center of the yard and set them ablaze. The bright, hot fire would drive any snakes far away for a week or more. Evelyn, seeing the charred circle the next morning, simply felt a sense of relief, never knowing the danger that had been averted. These were the invisible threads he wove around her, a net of silent care. Evelyn, meanwhile, was weaving threads of her own. Her work on the town's news sheet gave her a reason to ask questions and to look at the official records stored in a dusty back room of the sheriff's office. She was researching a story on land ownership, and as she painstakingly reviewed the county ledgers, a pattern began to emerge. Several small homesteads, all bordering the river and all adjacent to the Danelands, had recently been foreclosed on and acquired by Lucius Brand's cattle company. The reason was always the same: failure to repay a debt for supplies. But the numbers seemed wrong, inflated. She found one ledger with a torn page, and tucked within its folds, she found the original page that had been clumsily replaced. The original debt was a fraction of the amount recorded on the forged page. It was a cold, methodical system of theft, hiding in plain sight behind a veneer of legality. She took her discovery to Sheriff Matters. She laid the ledgers out on his desk, her finger tracing the crude alterations. The sheriff's face, usually a mask of weary competence, seemed to sag. He ran a hand over his jaw and stared at the evidence, not with surprise, but with a deep, profound resignation. He admitted that he had his suspicions for months, but suspecting Lucius Brand and proving it were two different things. The man had judges in his pocket and a private army of cowboys who were not afraid to enforce their employer's will. He warned Evelyn to drop it, for her own safety. The Red Basin riders, he said in a low voice, had been seen in the territory again, and they were often drawn to the sort of trouble that Brand stirred up. He was a man who wanted to do his duty but was terrified of the consequences. His fear was another wall around the town's secrets. Frustrated and angry, Evelyn found herself drawn back to the river that night. The moon was a perfect silver coin in a sea of black, its light turning the surface of the water to polished obsidian. The air was cool and smelled of damp earth and sage. The roar of the flood was gone, replaced by the river's gentle murmur, a peaceful sound that did little to soothe her troubled mind. She was so lost in thought that she did not hear him approach. "The river is quieter than the teacher," a low voice said from the shadows. Evelyn gasped and spun around. Kaya Nez stood by a cluster of willows, his form a silhouette against the moonlight. He was not looking at her, but at the water. "You startled me," she said, her heart hammering against her ribs. He turned his head slowly, his gaze finally meeting hers. "That was not my wish." They stood in silence for a long moment, the only sounds the river and the distant call of a night owl. She had 1,000 questions, but they all seemed to evaporate in the intensity of his presence. She was certain, with a certainty that went deeper than logic, that he was the one. "You talk a great deal in your school," he said, his voice a soft rumble, "about courage." "I believe in it," she replied, her voice barely a whisper. "It is a dangerous thing to believe in. It invites trouble." "And you are so quiet," she countered, taking a small step closer, "that I can hear my own heart beating." A flicker of something, perhaps a ghost of a smile, touched his lips. "Your heart has a lot to say." He looked down at her wrist, at the yucca bracelet she still wore. He did not need to say the words. His eyes said everything. He was her rescuer. In that shared, silent acknowledgement, a new and powerful connection was forged between them, as real and invisible as the moonlight that bathed them. Their newfound bond was tested only a few days later. A group of riders, men with the hard, cruel faces of the Red Basin gang, rode through the Dine settlement by the river. They did not attack, but their presence was a violation. They galloped between the hogans, their whoops and hollers a deliberate act of intimidation, their horses trampling the new corn shoots that had just begun to poke through the damp earth. It was a message, sent by Lucius Brand, a warning to the Dine and to anyone who might stand with them. Evelyn saw the aftermath the next day. She saw the trampled fields and the frightened, angry faces of the families. She saw Kaya organizing the men to repair a damaged fence, his face a mask of cold fury. In that moment, her purpose became crystal clear. The forged ledgers, the intimidation, the whispers against Kaya, it was all one story, one great injustice. And she could not stand by and simply report on it. She had to act. She knew her next step would be a dangerous one. It would draw a line in the sand of dry cedar. It would turn Brand's veiled animosity into open hostility. But looking at Kaya, seeing the quiet strength with which he protected his people, she knew it was a risk she had to take. That afternoon, she walked out to the Dine camp. She found him by the river, skipping stones across the water's surface, his movements fluid and precise. "Kaya Nez," she said, her voice firm and clear. He turned, his expression guarded. "I would like to invite you to my school," she said, her heart beating that fast. Loud rhythm once again. "I want you to speak to the children. I want you to tell them the stories of your people, the true stories." I want them to see the man who saved my life." He stared at her, his dark eyes searching her face. He saw no fear, only a fierce, unwavering resolve that matched his own. To accept was to step out of the shadows, to paint a target on both their backs. It was to turn his private obsession into a public declaration. But to refuse was to let the fear win, to allow the lies and the prejudice to fester in the next generation, in the hearts of the very children she was trying to teach. He looked from her determined face to the schoolhouse in the distance, a small wooden bastion of hope against the vast, harsh landscape. He gave a single, slow nod. A small, cultural bridge was about to be built, and they would be the ones to walk across it first, whatever the cost. The attack came in the dead of night, under a sliver of moon that offered no friendly light. Fire was its weapon. The target was the Dine-Horse Corral, a large, well-built structure that housed the community's most valuable animals. The Red Basin riders did not come with whoops and hollers this time. They came like wraiths, their movements swift and silent. They stacked dry brush against the wooden walls, doused it with oil, and touched it with a torch. The dry timber, baked by the desert sun for years, erupted in an instantaneous whoosh of flame, a hungry orange beast consuming the night. The screams of the terrified horses were the first alarm. It was a sound of pure panic, a nightmare chorus that ripped Cayanez from a light sleep. He was outside his hogan in an instant, the hellish glow of the fire painting the world in stark shades of orange and black. The corral was an inferno. But it was not the horses that made his blood run cold. It was the sight of two small children, frozen with terror, standing near the corral gate, mesmerized by the terrible beauty of the flames, while a burning support beam above them groaned, ready to give way. He moved, a blur of motion against the flickering light. He shoved the children back, throwing them clear of the gate just as the massive beam crashed down where they had been standing, sending a volcano of sparks into the night sky. He turned to push them further toward safety when a section of the burning roof collapsed inward. He shielded the smaller child with his own body, a searing pain lashing across his left arm and shoulder as a flaming piece of timber struck him. He ignored it, his focus absolute. He got the children to their mother and then turned back to the fire, joining the other men who were desperately trying to free the horses that had not already perished. The heat was a physical blow, the air thick with the acrid smoke of burning wood and hair. Evelyn Hart arrived as the flames began to die down, brought by the terrible red glow that was visible even from town. She saw the smoking ruin, the dark, unmoving shapes of the horses that had been lost. Her eyes frantically searched the chaotic scene until she saw him. Kaya was standing apart from the others, his face grim, his left arm held stiffly at his side. The sleeve of his shirt was scorched and bloodied. Her heart leaped into her throat. She ran to him, her slippers kicking up ash. She took him to the hogan of an elderly woman named Gleaming Stone, who was known for her knowledge of healing. Inside, the air was calm, smelling of sage and cedar. Gleaming Stone cleaned the wound with a decoction of boiled herbs, her movements ancient and practiced, before nodding at Evelyn and leaving them in the quiet privacy of the small dwelling. A single oil lamp cast a soft, warm light. Evelyn took the clean cloth from the bowl of warm water. Her hands trembled as she began to gently clean the edges of the burn that stretched across his shoulder and down his bicep. It was a nasty wound, angry and red, blistered in places. He sat perfectly still on a low stool, his back to her, his posture rigid. He did not flinch, but she could feel the tension in his muscles, the tight control he was exerting over his pain. The silence stretched, filled only by the soft dab of the cloth against his skin. She worked with a delicate focus, her touch as light as she could make it. The sight of his injury, of his vulnerability, cracked open something deep inside her. This was the man who had pulled her from the river, a figure of seemingly invincible strength. To see him hurt, and to be the one tending to him, felt like a profound and terrifying intimacy. "It must hurt terribly," she whispered. her voice unsteady. "It is a fire," he said, his voice a low rasp. "It is supposed to hurt." She finished cleaning the wound and began to apply a soothing salve of crushed leaves the old woman had left for her. Her fingers brushed against his warm, uninjured skin, and a jolt went through them both. He drew in a sharp breath. She paused, her hand hovering just above his shoulder. Slowly, he turned his head, his dark eyes meeting hers in the lamplight. The guarded walls he usually kept around himself were gone, burned away by the night's events. In their place was a raw, unguarded emotion that made her own breath catch. His gaze dropped to her lips. She leaned in, a magnetic pull she was powerless to resist. Their first kiss was not a thing of passion, but of quiet discovery. It was gentle, hesitant, a soft meeting of lips that tasted of smoke and desperation and a sorrow too deep for words. It was a question asked and answered in the same moment. When they broke apart, their foreheads rested against each other. "Do not move," he murmured, his voice thick. "It still hurts." She smiled, a fragile, trembling thing. She raised a hand to cup his jaw, her thumb stroking his cheek. "It hurts a little," she whispered back, her voice finding a bit of its familiar playful strength. "But if you stop, it will probably hurt a lot more." He closed his eyes, a faint shudder running through him. The second kiss was deeper, a confirmation, a sealing of the unspoken promise that had been growing between them since that night by the river. It was slow and deliberate, a conversation without words, an acknowledgement of the profound and dangerous path they had just stepped onto together. After she had carefully wrapped his arm in clean bandages, they sat in the quiet of the hogan. The fire outside had awoken ghosts for Kaya. He stared into the flame of the lamp, but he was seeing another fire. Years ago. "The smell," he said, his voice distant. "It is the same." He told her then of the night he had lost his family. He had been a boy, away on his first solo hunt. He returned to find their camp a smoking ruin, much like the corral. There were no survivors. The raiders had not been after anything of value. They had come only to destroy, and they had left their mark, a brand seared into the scorched earth where his family's hogan had stood. A simple, brutal design, the letter B, a vertical line, and the letter R. B, vertical bar R. Brand Ranch? He had no proof, only the mark and the cold certainty in his gut that had hardened into an unmovable conviction over the years. "Tonight," he said, his voice low and intense, his gaze finally turning from the lamp to her. "When I saw the flames, and I saw the children, I knew I would not let it happen again. I cannot, It was then that he confessed the rest of what was in his heart. He told her of the moment on the rock, watching her breathe, the overwhelming feeling that had washed over him. He told her of the word that had come to his mind, the English word he had learned from her world, obsession. "It sounded like a curse," he said, his voice heavy with the weight of the admission. "To want to watch over someone so much that it burns, like a fire inside. But it is a curse I chose. That night, I chose it, to protect you from this same fire. That is why I fixed your roof. That is why I drove away the snake. It is a foolish thing for a man like me." Evelyn listened, her heart aching for the boy who had lost everything and the man who had been carrying that pain alone for so long. She took his uninjured hand, her fingers lacing through his. "It is not a foolish thing, Kaya," she said softly. "It is the most beautiful and brave thing I have ever heard." His obsession was not the possessive, crazed thing the word implied. It was a vow, a sacred, self-imposed duty. The next day, the raw reality of their situation settled in. The fire had been a message from Brand, a clear escalation. When Evelyn went into town, she found Sheriff Matters looking older and more tired than ever. He pulled her into his office and shut the door. He did not have the courage to confront Brand directly, but the attack, the blatant attempt on the lives of children, had pushed him past his limit of passive complicity. He lifted a heavy, water-damaged wooden box onto his desk, "I cannot make an accusation," he said, his voice low and conspiratorial. "But you can find the truth." He opened the box. Inside was a chaotic jumble of papers, many of them torn to shreds. These are old tax ledgers, debt records, things Brand's people thought were destroyed in a storeroom flood last year. They were not. They are a mess. But you are good with words, good with puzzles. He looked at her, his eyes pleading. If there is proof of his crimes, it is in there. You are the only one who can piece it together. He was handing her the weapon, even if he was too afraid to wield it himself. That night, Evelyn and Kaya sat on a blanket on a high mesa overlooking the valley. The sky was a vast, clear canvas of deepest indigo. She had told him about the box of papers, and they both knew it was their new path, their way to fight back not with fire, but with facts. As they spoke, the sky began to put on a show. A single, brilliant streak of light tore across the darkness, followed by another and another, a meteor shower. They fell silent, watching the celestial display, humbled by its silent, impossible beauty. The falling stars seemed to sweep the world clean, offering a moment of pure, unburdened peace. Kaya lay back on the blanket, his bandaged arm resting on his chest. Evelyn lay beside him, her head resting in the crook of his good shoulder. In this place, under this sky. They were not a Dine scout and an Eastern school teacher. They were simply two people finding solace in each other's presence. He turned his head, his breath warm against her hair. "I have never belonged to a place," he said quietly, his voice full of a strange wonder, as if he were discovering the thought for the first time. "My people have the land, but my heart has always been a wanderer, but it is not a wanderer anymore." He paused, and when he spoke again, his words were a quiet vow, as profound and beautiful as the falling stars. "I belong to no one, except the place where your laughter is." Evelyn closed her eyes, a single, happy tear tracing a path through the dust on her cheek. Their love was now as certain as the stars, and their purpose was as clear as the night sky. The time for defense was over. The time for seeking justice had begun. Lucius Brand did not respond to Evelyn's challenge with fire or fists, but with a flood of poison. He moved through dry cedar like a preacher of paranoia, his voice a low, reasonable thrum in the saloon, a concerned murmur in the general store. He spoke of safety, of protecting the town's women and children. He spun a narrative where the recent fire was not an act of aggression but a symptom of a larger disease. He painted the Dine as a secretive, hostile presence, and Kayanez as their agent, a man of divided loyalties, a shadow who could be guiding the Red Basin riders for a share of the silver payroll. He played on the town's deepest prejudices, watering the seeds of fear he had planted weeks ago until they grew into a thicket of suspicion. His words found fertile ground. The fear of the outlaws was real, and it was easier to blame a silent, familiar outsider than a faceless, distant threat. Brand proposed the formation of a vigilance committee, a group of concerned citizens who would take responsibility for the town's security where the law, he insinuated, was failing. It was a call for mob rule, wrapped in the noble language of civic duty. The town hall meeting was his stage. The room was packed, the air thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, cheap tobacco, and simmering anxiety. Brand stood at the front, not behind the lectern, but in front of it, placing himself among the people. He spoke with the conviction of a man who believed his own lies. He called for the immediate expulsion of the Dine from the Riverlands and for the arrest of Kayanez as a material witness and suspected accomplice in the planned payroll robbery. "He reads the signs, doesn't he?" Brand said, his voice resonating with false sincerity. "Reads the earth, the sky. What's to say he isn't reading the tracks of the Red Basin gang and selling that knowledge?" A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. Sheriff Matters stood near the wall, his face a stony mask, his hands clasped behind his back. He looked trapped, a man watching a wildfire approach his home, holding only a leaky bucket. It was into this charged atmosphere that Evelyn Hart walked. She did not enter timidly, but with a determined stride, a heavy satchel in her hand. All eyes turned to her. She walked to the front of the room and placed her satchel on the lectern Brand had disdained. "You speak of signs, Mr. Brand," she said, her voice clear and steady, cutting through the murmuring. "I have been reading signs as well, not in the dirt, but on paper." She pulled out a series of large sheets of pasteboard. On them, she had painstakingly glued together the shredded remnants of the ledgers Matters had given her. It was a mosaic of deceit, a jigsaw puzzle of Brand's greed. For weeks, she had worked late into the night, her fingers sticky with flour paste, her eyes straining in the lamplight, fitting tiny scraps of paper together, matching the faded ink, the grain of the paper, the telltale curve of a number. "This," she announced, holding up the first board, "is the original supply ledger for the Miller homestead. You will see their debt to you was for $50. And this," she held up a second, reconstructed page, "is the forged document you filed with the county, claiming a debt of $500, a debt that forced them off their land which you now own." She went on, board by board, laying out the systematic fraud, the cold, calculated theft that had dispossessed half a dozen families. She spoke with the calm precision of a schoolteacher explaining a difficult problem in arithmetic. The room fell silent, the angry bluster replaced by a confused, uncertain stillness. Some faces in the crowd, those of men who worked for Brand, hardened with anger. But others, the small homesteaders and merchants, looked from the damning evidence to Brand's face. A flicker of doubt in their eyes. Brand's calm demeanor shattered. A dark flush crept up his neck. But before he could speak, Evelyn turned her attention to the fire. "And I was on the river road the night of the flood. I saw men from your ranch, Mr. Brand, felling trees into the river, trying to create a dam, trying to divert the water. Was that to protect the town, or to flood the Dine farms and drive them from their homes?" The accusation hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. Sheriff Matters finally stirred, taking a half step forward, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol, but he hesitated. The moment stretched, taut and fragile. Brand's power was still a palpable force in the room, and the sheriff's courage was a flickering candle against that gale. Lucius Brand did not wait for the law. He recovered his composure with terrifying speed, his rage cooling into something far more dangerous. He saw that he could not win with reason, so he attacked the messenger. He let a cruel smile spread across his face. "The town schoolteacher," he said, his voice dripping with condescension, "seems to have spent a great deal of time in the company of the very man she should fear. Perhaps her judgment has been clouded." His counterattack came the next morning. Two of his ranch hands, wearing hastily acquired deputy badges that fooled no one, appeared at Evelyn's boarding house. They had a warrant, signed by a traveling judge who was a known associate of Brand's, for her arrest. The charge was public lewdness and immoral cohabitation, a vicious, baseless accusation designed to destroy her reputation and silence her completely. They took her from the house publicly, making a spectacle of it, marching her down the main street, her students, on their way to school, saw her being led away, their faces a mixture of confusion and fear, from the shadows of the livery stable. Kaya watched, his entire body rigid with a fury so cold it felt like ice in his veins. Every instinct screamed at him to intervene, to tear these men apart, but he knew it was a trap. If he made a move, he would prove Brand's accusations, validate the warrant, and give the newly formed Vigilance Committee the excuse they needed to start a war. He was forced to remain in the shadows, a helpless observer, as the woman he loved was locked away. The twist, the event that changed the entire game, came from an unexpected source. That afternoon, a frantic telegraph operator sought out Sheriff Matters. He had a friend who worked the line further north, a man who sometimes relayed information that was not strictly official. A large army payroll shipment, mostly in gold coin, was being secretly moved by wagon through the territory. It was scheduled to pass through Coyote Narrows, a tight, winding canyon about 20 miles from Dry Cedar, the day after tomorrow. And the telegraph operator's friend had overheard two men, known associates of the Red Basin Riders, talking about it in a saloon. They were not talking about hitting the Dry Cedar silver shipment. They were talking about a much bigger prize. Suddenly, everything clicked into place for Matters. The Riders' presence in the area was not about Brand's petty land grab. They had been using Brand's conflict as a cover, a perfect distraction, while they planned a federal robbery. They were not Brand's loyal hounds. They were wolves that had allowed him to think he was their master. This changed everything. Robbing a homesteader was a local problem. Robbing the United States Army was an act of war. It gave Matters the authority and the desperate courage he had been lacking. That night, he met Kaya in secret, in a grove of cottonwoods far from the town's prying eyes. Matters laid out the situation. He needed a tracker, a scout, someone who knew Coyote Narrows better than the coyotes themselves. He needed Kaya. Kaya listened, his face impassive in the moonlight. To trust this man, the symbol of the law that had so often failed his people, was a great risk. But he also saw the path it offered. "You want to set a trap," Kaya stated. It was not a question. "I want to end this," Matters said, his voice raw with exhaustion. "All of it." Kaya agreed, but on one condition: his people would help, but the law had to help them in return. The fraudulent land claims had to be investigated, officially, and Evelyn Hart had to be freed. Matters, seeing no other way, gave his word. The alliance was fragile, born of desperation. Kaya then had to convince his own elders, men who had learned through bitter experience to distrust any offer from the white man's world. He argued with a quiet, forceful passion. This was not about helping the town. It was about protecting their own homes. The Red Basin Riders were a storm that would consume everyone in its path, dine and settler alike. By helping Matters, they were not serving the town's justice, but their own. Reluctantly, the elders agreed. Meanwhile, Evelyn was not a passive prisoner. She was being held in a locked room at the hotel, a guard posted outside her door. Her mind raced, searching for a way out. Her salvation came in the form of two women she would have least expected. Sarah, the blacksmith's wife, a large, no-nonsense woman with flour perpetually on her elbows, and Maria, the wife of a small-time rancher who had been squeezed by Brand's tactics. They had seen the injustice of Evelyn's arrest, and they were not women to stand by and watch a bully win. Their plan was simple and effective. Sarah started a loud, furious argument with her husband in the street right below Evelyn's window, a magnificent piece of public theater that drew a crowd, including the guard. At the same time, Maria, who had gained access to the hotel's back rooms with a delivery of laundry, used a spare key to unlock Evelyn's door. "Get out of here, teacher," Maria whispered, shoving a bundle containing a boy's trousers, a shirt, and a hat into her hands. "Your horse is tied up behind the livery. Ride east. Follow the creek. There is an old line shack in the foothills. Wait there." There was no time for thanks. Evelyn changed her clothes, her heart pounding, and slipped out the back of the hotel. The feigned brawl in the street was reaching its crescendo. No one noticed the slender figure in boy's clothing untying a horse and melting into the darkness. She rode hard, not looking back, the cool night air a balm on her face. Behind her, an unlikely alliance of lawmen and dine warriors was preparing to ride toward Coyote Narrows. The flood of men was coming, and the fate of the entire territory would be decided in the stony confines of that desolate canyon. The day of the ambush dawned under a sky the color of old brass. The air was unnaturally still and hot, holding its breath before an inevitable exhalation of fury. By mid-morning, the wind began to rise, not as a breeze, but as a low, mournful moan that seemed to come from the earth itself. It picked up the fine red dust, at first in lazy swirls, then in stinging, horizontal sheets. By the time the posse of Sheriff Matters, his few loyal deputies, and Kaya's silent Dine warriors reached the entrance to Coyote Narrows, the world had been reduced to a roaring, saffron-tinted twilight. The sun was a pale, impotent disk behind a curtain of sand. The wind howled through the rock formations of the canyon, its voice a high, piercing shriek, like a flute carved from stone. Lucius Brand and a handful of his vigilance committee had insisted on joining the posse, their presence a sour note in the fragile alliance. Brand claimed it was his civic duty, but Kaya saw the truth in the man's eyes. He was not there to help the law, but to oversee the chaos, to ensure that the Red Basin Riders were silenced permanently, along with any inconvenient truths they might carry. Their trap was laid in the narrowest part of the canyon, a winding passage with sheer rock walls on both sides. Kaya directed the men with quiet, precise hand signals. Several Dine warriors, carrying unlit torches wrapped in oil-soaked rags, climbed to the high ledges, disappearing into the swirling dust. Others worked with Matters' deputies, positioning a series of large, precariously balanced boulders above the canyon's northern entrance. The Riders' only escape route. They were not an army. They were a handful of desperate men using the land itself as their primary weapon. Evelyn Hart did not stay in the line shack. After a few restless hours, the need to act, to be a part of the resolution she had helped set in motion, became an unbearable imperative. She had seen the direction the posse had taken, and she knew where they were going. With her hair tucked under her boy's hat and her face wrapped in a kerchief against the dust, she followed at a distance. The sandstorm, which would have blinded a less determined rider, became her cover. She reached the outskirts of the Narrows just as the storm hit its peak, tethering her horse in a sheltered wash and making her way on foot to a high ridge that gave her a precarious, dust-shrouded view of the canyon floor below. She clutched the small rifle Silas. The farmer whose buckboard had been destroyed had insisted she take from the line shack. The waiting was a torment. The wind scoured the rock, and the sand stung any exposed patch of skin. Then, through the roar, came a new sound, the rhythmic beat of shod hooves. The Red Basin Riders appeared out of the yellow gloom. A dozen grim figures hunched in their saddles, their faces masked against the storm. They rode with the confidence of men who believed they were the most dangerous thing in the wilderness. They were halfway through the narrowest pass when Kaya gave the signal. The torches on the high ledges flared to life. In the thick, swirling dust, the single points of light created a terrifying illusion. They seemed to dance and multiply, suggesting a force of 50 men where there were only 5. The riders reined in their horses, the animals snorting and rearing in confusion, their riders reaching for their pistols. At that moment, from her perch, Evelyn saw the leader of the gang spot a potential escape route, a narrow side canyon the posse had not been able to cover. He was shouting, pointing, trying to rally his men to break through. Without a second thought, she shouldered the rifle, aimed at the rock face a few feet above his head, and fired. The crack of the shot was sharp and clear, even above the wind. A spray of rock chips exploded from the canyon wall, and the outlaw leader's horse shied violently. The moment of indecision she created was all Kaya needed. Another signal, and the men at the canyon entrance heaved against their levers. The precariously balanced boulders tipped and fell, crashing down to the canyon floor in an avalanche of rock and dust, sealing the exit completely. The Red Basin Riders were caged. The ensuing confrontation was brief and brutal, a confused melee of shouting and gunfire in the blinding dust. Kaya and his men seemed to be everywhere at once, using the poor visibility to their advantage, appearing and disappearing like ghosts. They were not trying to kill, they were trying to disable. They targeted horses, used the butts of their rifles, and fought with a cold, efficient fury. One by one, the outlaws were pulled from their saddles, disarmed, and bound. As the dust began to settle slightly, Sheriff Matters stepped forward to take charge of the prisoners. The leader of the gang, a man with a scarred face and eyes full of venomous hatred, was shoved to his knees. He looked past Matters, his gaze fixing on Lucius Brand, who was watching the proceedings with a look of smug satisfaction. "Well, Brand," the outlaw snarled, spitting a stream of bloody saliva onto the sand. "Looks like your plan to have us all put in the ground went sideways." He laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "You want your property back with a sudden movement." He reached inside his jacket and pulled out a heavy, dark object. It was not a weapon. He threw it, and it landed in the dust at Brand's feet with a dull thud. It was a branding iron. The head was a simple, brutal Design B vertical bar R. The world seemed to stop. The wind died down to a low moan. Kaya stared at the brand, the symbol of his life's defining tragedy, now lying in the open for all to see. It was proof, irrefutable and damning. It connected Brand not just to the recent fire, but to a past steeped in blood and ashes. Brand's face went pale, his mask of civic virtue dissolving to reveal the cornered predator beneath. He knew the game was over. He saw Matters staring at the brand, the final piece of the puzzle clicking into place in the sheriff's mind. He saw Kaya, whose eyes burned with a cold, righteous fire that promised a reckoning decades in the making. Brand's hand darted to the pistol at his hip. He could not allow any of them to leave this canyon alive. He moved to eliminate the greatest threats first. He saw Matters as the law, but he saw Kaya as the soul of the resistance. His pistol came up, aiming directly at Kaya's chest. "Kaya, look out!" Evelyn screamed from the ridge. But Matters was closer. In that split second, all his years of compromise and cowardice fell away. He saw not a Dine scout, but a man who had stood for justice when he had not. He did not hesitate. He lunged, shoving Kaya hard, sending him stumbling to the ground. Brand's pistol fired. The bullet meant for Kaya's heart, instead ripping through the fleshy part of the sheriff's arm. Matters ignored the searing pain. His own gun was already in his hand. He fired once, not to kill, but to disarm. The shot was true, striking Brand's pistol and sending it spinning into the dust. Brand clutched his stinging, useless hand, his face a mask of disbelief and pure hatred. His men, the so-called Vigilance Committee, seeing their leader disgraced and disarmed, simply melted back into the rocks, their loyalty as thin as the dying wind. Brand was alone. He gave Kaya one last look, a look that was a pure, unholy promise of vengeance. "This is not over," he spat, his voice a venomous whisper. "I will burn you all. I will burn the river, the school, everything. I will turn your whole world to ash." Then, before anyone could react, he scrambled up a narrow fissure in the canyon wall and disappeared over the ridge. He had escaped, but he was no longer a pillar of the community. He was a fugitive, an arsonist, and a murderer, his crimes laid bare for all to see. Matters stood, clutching his bleeding arm, his face grim but resolute. He had finally chosen a side. The Red Basin Riders were captured, their threat neutralized. But as the last of the dust settled in Coyote Narrows, everyone knew the real battle. The final confrontation for the soul of Dry Cedar was yet to come. Lucius Brand's vengeance was not long in coming. It arrived on the breath of a hot, dry wind that blew from the south, a wind that sucked the last vestiges of moisture from the tall prairie grass, leaving it as brittle and flammable as old paper. The night was dark, with only a scattering of hostile-looking stars in a black sky. The promised cleansing rain had not yet come. Instead, the air itself felt combustible, charged with a malevolent energy. The first sign was a flicker of orange on the horizon, far downriver. It was so small at first that it could have been a lonely campfire. But it did not stay small. It grew with unnatural speed, blooming from a flicker to a glow, and then to a terrifying horizontal line of fire that began to devour the darkness. Brand had kept his promise. He was burning their world. The fire moved with the wind, a devouring beast of impossible speed. It raced along the riverbank, its primary target the fertile lands of the Dene and the homesteads that bordered them. But its ultimate goal was the town of Dry Cedar itself, and at the heart of the town, the schoolhouse, the symbol of everything Brand had come to despise. Cayanez saw the fire from the mesa where he had been keeping watch. He needed no explanation. He was on his horse in an instant, a silent alarm that spread through the dine camp, not with bells or shouts, but with a sudden, urgent sense of purpose. Men emerged from their hogans, their faces grim in the flickering orange light. In town, the fire created panic. People poured out of the saloon in their homes, their faces pale with terror. But this was not the same town it had been a week ago. The fear was tempered by a new, hard-won resolve. When Sheriff Matters, his arm in a makeshift sling, began shouting orders, people listened. He called for bucket brigades, for men to grab shovels and axes. And when Kaya and a dozen dine riders appeared out of the darkness, there were no suspicious glances, no muttered insults. The homesteaders who had been cheated by Brand, the blacksmith, the merchants they saw not strangers, but allies. The fire had burned away the last of their prejudice. They were one community now, united against a common doom. Evelyn was at the schoolhouse, frantically gathering her books and the precious, reassembled ledgers. She knew Brand would come for her. She was the voice that had exposed him, the mind that had unraveled his schemes. The schoolhouse was her territory, and she would not abandon it easily. She was shoving the last of the papers into a leather satchel when the door burst open. It was Brand. He was a terrifying sight, his face smudged with soot, his eyes wide with a feverish, manic glee. He held a lit torch in one hand and a pistol in the other. He looked at her, and at the schoolhouse around her, with an expression of pure, possessive hatred. "I told you I would turn it all to ash," he said, his voice a hoarse croak, "and I always keep my promises." He grabbed her by the arm, his grip like iron. He was not just a fugitive now. He was a force of pure destruction, a man who had lost everything and intended to drag the entire world down with him. He dragged her from the schoolhouse, using her as a human shield, pulling her toward the river, toward the heart of the inferno he had created. Kaya's combined force worked with a desperate, disciplined fury. They were not trying to fight the main fire front that was impossible. Instead, Kaya directed them to a point downriver from the town, where a series of old irrigation ditches ran from the San Juan to the fields. Their goal was twofold: to create a firebreak, a wide scar of cleared earth that the fire could not jump, and to divert water from the river into the ditches, creating a moat of wet earth around the schoolhouse. It was a race against the wind and the flames. The air was scorchingly hot, thick with smoke that clawed at their lungs. Townspeople and dine worked side by side, their differences forgotten, their sweat and fear mingling in the red dirt. Brand pulled Evelyn along the riverbank, toward a high, flat-topped rock that jutted out over the water. The heat from the approaching fire was intense. On the other side, the river churned, its surface reflecting the terrible orange light. They were on an island between two destructions. "You see," he shouted over the roar of the flames, "this is power to unmake the world. This is the only legacy that matters." Evelyn did not scream or struggle. Her mind, honed by years of teaching and reasoning, was her only weapon. She dug her heels in, forcing him to stop. She looked him directly in the eye, her own gaze clear and unafraid. "They will rebuild," she said, her voice surprisingly calm and strong. "They will plant new corn. The houses will be built again. But do you know what will last forever? The story they tell their children." Brand stared at her, his mad glee faltering for a second, replaced by a flicker of confusion. "They will not remember the buildings you burned," Evelyn continued, pressing her advantage. "They will remember your face. The children who saw you today, the children whose homes are now ashes, will grow up telling the story of the man who came in the night with fire. That will be your legacy. Not a cattle baron, not a town founder, just a monster in a child's nightmare. They will remember your face. Lucius Brand, for 100 years." Her words struck a chord he had not known existed. He had built his entire life on the idea of a legacy, of a name that would command respect. The thought of being remembered only as a villain, a bogeyman, seemed to shake him to his core. For a crucial instant, his grip on her arm loosened. His eyes, for the first time, showed not rage, but a flicker of horrified doubt. That was the moment Kaya arrived. He came not like a hero in a storybook, but like an animal of the night, emerging from the smoke, his face set like carved stone. He did not speak. He did not need to. His presence was a judgment. Brand was jolted from his stupor. He shoved Evelyn away from him, toward the edge of the rock, and raised his pistol. His hatred for Kaya overriding everything else, the final confrontation had come. It was not a prolonged duel. It was a desperate, clumsy scramble on the high rock, which was slick with spray from the river. The fire roared on one side, a wall of heat and sound. The dark, churning water beckoned on the other. Brand lunged at Kaya, a wild, clumsy attack born of pure rage. Kaya sidestepped, using Brand's own momentum against him. Brand stumbled, his heavy boots skidding on the wet stone. He pinwheeled his arms, fighting for balance on the very edge of the precipice. For a moment, he seemed to steady himself. He let out a triumphant, ugly laugh. But as he did, the ground beneath his feet trembled. A plume of steam hissed from a crack in the rock, followed by a sudden, violent eruption of boiling water. They were standing on the edge of a small, hidden geyser, a hot spring that was part of the river's restless, subterranean life. The scalding water shot upward, striking Brand's legs. He screamed, a sound of agony and surprise, and jerked backward from the heat. His foot found no purchase. He slipped, and with a final, desperate cry that was swallowed by the roar of the fire in the river, Lucius Brand fell from the rock and disappeared into the churning, black water below. Nature, the force he had sought to conquer and control, had delivered its own verdict. Kaya rushed to Evelyn's side, pulling her away from the edge, his arms wrapping around her as much to reassure himself that she was real as to comfort her. They stood for a moment, watching the place where Brand had vanished, the fire still raging behind them. Then, as if on cue, the first fat drop of rain struck Evelyn's cheek. It was followed by another, and another. The wind, which had been driving the fire, suddenly shifted, carrying with it the smell of blessed, life-giving water. A low rumble of thunder echoed from the mountains. The summer storm, so long awaited, had finally arrived. The rain came down in a torrent, a cool, cleansing flood from the heavens. It hissed against the flames, turning the roaring fire into a sputtering, steaming protest. Sheriff Matters, his arm bandaged, appeared out of the smoke, followed by his deputies. They rounded up the last of Brand's paid thugs, who had lost all will to fight. Matters looked from the captured men to the dying fire, then to Kaya and Evelyn, who were now walking back from the rock. He simply nodded, a gesture of profound respect and shared victory. The rain fell on dry cedar, dousing the last of the embers, washing the soot from the air, and turning the red dust to a dark, clean mud. It was the smell of a new beginning. The fire was out. The town had been wounded, but it had not been broken. It had been cleansed. The morning after the fire was a world reborn. The rain had washed the sky to a brilliant, cloudless blue and scrubbed the air clean of smoke and fear. The land, though scarred with black patches, smelled of damp earth, wet sage, and the promise of new growth. Dry cedar was wounded, but its heart was still beating, stronger and more unified than ever before. The fire had been a trial, a terrible baptism that had burned away the rot of prejudice and greed, leaving behind the resilient bedrock of a true community. In the weeks that followed, the changes were not just spoken. They were written into law. A circuit judge, a stern but fair man from the territorial capital, arrived to preside over the legal aftermath. Brand's captured henchmen were tried and sentenced. Their testimony, combined with the outlaw leader's confession and Evelyn's painstakingly reassembled ledgers, painting a complete picture of Lucius Brand's reign of corruption. The judge's most significant ruling concerned Brand's vast, ill-gotten estate, citing the clear evidence of fraud. He declared all of Brand's landholdings forfeit to the territory, in a move that stunned and delighted the citizens of Dry Cedar. He decreed that a significant portion of the land, including the fertile fields along the river, would be placed into a public trust. Its purpose was to fund the construction of a new, larger schoolhouse, built of stone and timber, a permanent institution for all the children of the valley. The town's own transformation was codified in a simple but revolutionary ordinance. At the next town meeting, held in the open air beside the frame of the new school, Sheriff Cole Matters, his arm now healing cleanly, stood before the assembled people. He proposed a new law, one he called the Household Guardianship Act. It was a formal, legal recognition of families of mixed heritage, granting them the full protection of the law and the same rights of ownership and inheritance as any other family. It was a direct response to the ugly accusations that had been leveled against Evelyn, a public declaration that the town would no longer tolerate prejudice as a weapon. The motion was seconded by Sarah, the blacksmith's wife, and passed with a unanimous chorus of ayes. It was a quiet, profound victory for a justice that was not just blind, but compassionate. But the most beautiful sign of healing was not written on paper, but on the hearts of the children. One golden afternoon, Evelyn and Kaya gathered the students by the banks of the San Juan. The river, once a site of terror and confrontation, was now calm and clear, flowing peacefully within its banks. An elderly dine singer, a man with a face like a beautiful, weathered map, stood and sang a song of the river's spirit, a blessing for the water and the life it sustained. His voice, ancient and resonant, seemed to merge with the gentle murmur of the current. When he was finished, Evelyn took a smooth, flat piece of driftwood and a stick of charcoal. "This river has two names because it belongs to two peoples," she said to the children gathered around her, in clear, careful letters. She wrote Sanjuan. Then she handed the charcoal to Kaya. He knelt, and beside the English letters, he drew the symbols and characters for the river's dying name, Tubikai. He spoke the name aloud, its sound flowing as naturally as the water itself. Evelyn then had the children trace the letters and symbols in the damp sand with their fingers, their small hands bridging two worlds, their laughter a testament to the future they would all build together. That evening, the air was cool and sweet. Kaya led Evelyn to a small, newly built hogan he had constructed on a sandy bluff overlooking the river. It was simple and clean, the scent of fresh mud and cedar filling the small space. A fire burned low in the central pit, and a pot of sage tea steeped beside it, filling the air with its clean, sharp fragrance. They sat in comfortable silence for a long time, sipping the warm tea from clay cups, watching the stars begin to appear in the twilight sky. There was no need for grand speeches or passionate declarations. Everything that needed to be said had been proven through their actions, through the trials of fire and water they had endured together. Kaya reached into a small leather pouch and took something out. He took her hand, his calloused fingers warm and gentle against her own. He placed the object in her palm. It was the yucca bracelet, the one he had woven on the rock during the flood. It was old and frayed now, but to her, it was the most precious object in the world. He gently took it from her and slipped it back onto her wrist, his touch a solemn vow. "From that night on the river," he said, his voice a low, soft rumble that was for her alone, "my heart has belonged to you." Evelyn looked at him, her love for him a warm, steady light in her eyes. She thought of her old life in the East, of the constrained world she had fled. She had come west seeking freedom, and she had found it, but not in the way she had expected. She had found it not in solitude, but in connection, not in a place, but in a person. "I am staying," she said, her voice full of a quiet, unshakable certainty, "because this is home." The final image of their story was not one of closing doors, but of an opening horizon. It was the sight of a pair of golden eagles, soaring in wide, lazy circles high above the now peaceful San Juan River. their wings catching the last light of the setting sun. It was the sight of the dark, rich earth of the new community fields, where the first tender green shoots of a corn crop, planted by the hands of both Diney and settlers, were just beginning to push their way toward the sky. It was the image of a world that had been through the fire and had come out stronger, a land where the river ran true, and where life, in all its forms, was beginning again. Thank you for listening to our story. Please let us know in the comments where you're listening from so we can all connect, and be sure to subscribe to our channel Wild West Tales, like this video, and press that hype button to help this story reach more people.